Hey guys, tonight we're dimming the torches, settling into our drafty medieval bedchamber, and easing into a topic that's both quietly tragic and slightly ridiculous. Because, of course, it's medieval Europe. We're talking about bastards. Specifically, the children born out of wedlock to kings, queens, mistresses, servants, nuns, knights, and occasionally that one unlucky lady who just made eye contact with the wrong nobleman. Now, in medieval Europe, being born on the wrong side of the sheets wasn't just gossip. It was practically a legal condition. You could be beautiful, talented, and smarter than half the royal family. But if your parents forgot to sign the right marriage document, congratulations, you are now socially radioactive. So, tuck in, maybe light a candle if you want to feel the ambience. But, be careful, because this is a 1.5 hour story about medieval legitimacy. And by the time we're done, your candle might have burned out like the hopes of a royal mistress. Let's drift back to the early Middle Ages, around the 9th or 10th century, where family values were mostly an illusion kept together by papal paperwork and political convenience. The legal curse of being born. Wrong to start, it's worth remembering that the medieval church hated surprises, especially when it came to lineage. The church's entire moral structure revolved around proper unions, meaning a man and woman married in the sight of God, and ideally, witnessed by at least one disinterested monk. Anyone born outside that holy framework was considered illegitimate, literally not lawful. And in a world where your entire worth depended on what you could inherit, this was a problem. Bastards couldn't inherit land. They couldn't inherit titles. They often couldn't even join certain professions. In some cases, they couldn't enter monasteries, which was kind of the medieval version of saying, sorry, you can't even be unemployed properly. Of course, there were exceptions, because medieval rules were less rules and more guidelines, unless the king says otherwise. If your father was rich enough, or royal enough, or just felt guilty enough, he could sometimes convince the Pope to legitimize you, usually after paying an amount of money that would make modern lobbyists blush. This papal legitimization was like an ancient version of getting verified on Twitter. It didn't make you moral, it just made you official. Royal bastards, the acceptable kind. Let's float over to the courts of medieval Europe, where things got confusing fast. Kings, it turns out, were terrible at monogamy. In theory, they were supposed to marry one politically convenient bride and stick with her. In practice, royal marriages were like business contracts with built-in loopholes, and most kings used them generously. Take Henry I of England, for example. He reigned from 1100 to 1135 and had about 24 illegitimate children that we know of. And yes, that's 24, not counting the ones history forgot. Now, Henry was smart about it. He gave his bastards useful positions, made the sons bishops or knights, and married the daughters off to minor nobles. That way, he could sprinkle royal DNA around the country, like medieval confetti, while still keeping the main throne pure for his real heirs. Ironically, when his legitimate son drowned in the White Ship disaster, the only child left to inherit his kingdom was his daughter, Empress Matilda, who had to fight her cousin Stephen for the crown, a man descended from one of Henry's side branches. So yes, Henry's family drama became England's actual civil war. So much for keeping it in the family. the bastards who made it anyway. Despite all the rules, a few bastards actually thrived. Let's glide through a few of them, the overachievers of the illegitimate world. First, there's William the Conqueror. Yes, that William, who invaded England in 1066 and kicked off the Norman dynasty. William was born in Falaise, Normandy, the son of Duke Robert I and a woman named Herleva, who was very much not his wife. People used to call William the Bastard, not behind his back, to his face, which, given his later track record for setting people on fire, was brave. But William didn't care. He took the name, wore it like armor, and decided to conquer a whole kingdom. Which he did, obviously, because the English were still recovering from 500 years of Viking trauma and probably just too tired to resist. So, yes, the most famous king in early English history started life as a literal social outcast. It's like if your high school principal banned you from the talent show, so you came back 10 years later and bought the school. Another example, John of Gaunt's illegitimate children with his mistress, Catherine Swynford. John of Gaunt, who was basically the medieval equivalent of a British celebrity with too much money, had several children with her, all born while he was still married to someone else. But in a rare twist of romantic fortune, he actually married Catherine later, and then convinced the Pope to legitimize their children. These kids became the Beaufort family, and one of their descendants was none other than Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. So, in a roundabout way, the Tudors were literally built on a papal my bad. The Church's ongoing confusion. The Church, bless its bureaucratic heart, kept trying to define what exactly counted as legitimate. They came up with rules that were so specific and contradictory that even lawyers got confused. For instance, if your parents intended to marry, but the ceremony got delayed, maybe the priest was late, or someone forgot the dowry, the church might decide you were fine. But if your parents did marry, and then it turned out they were related in the 4th degree of consanguinity, which, to be fair, almost everyone was, then suddenly, poof, you were back to being a bastard again. It was like trying to win a game where the rules changed every Sunday. Life outside the castle? Of course, most illegitimate children weren't royal at all. They were born to peasants, tradespeople, or servants, and their lives were less about politics and more about survival. Among commoners, illegitimacy wasn't quite as catastrophic. Sure, there was stigma, especially from the church, but poor families had bigger problems than purity. If you could work the fields, you worked the fields. Nobody asked for your baptism certificate. Still, being a child of sin could follow you. Some villages marked such children in their baptismal records, using phrases like filius nullius, child of no one, which is both heartbreaking and weirdly poetic, in a medieval emo sort of way. Some illegitimate children ended up in monasteries or nunneries, especially if their parents wanted to make the problem quietly disappear. Others became soldiers, mercenaries, or household servants to the nobility, which was ironic, considering how many of them were probably serving their own fathers. Bastard daughters, a different kind of asset. For girls, the story had a different flavor, as it usually did in the Middle Ages. Illegitimate daughters couldn't inherit land, but they could be married off strategically. A nobleman might use his bastard daughters to seal alliances with minor knights or loyal servants. It was sort of like saying, Here, take my unofficial daughter and a modest dowry, and please don't revolt against me this year. Some royal mistresses even managed to get their daughters married to high-ranking men, especially if the father acknowledged them publicly. The key was visibility. If a powerful man admitted to fathering a bastard, the child's life often improved dramatically. If he denied it, or conveniently died before anyone could ask, the child was left in social limbo. For example, Charles II of England, the Merry Monarch, had at least a dozen acknowledged illegitimate children. He openly adored them, gave them titles, and basically turned the royal court into a half-royal daycare. His son, the Duke of Monmouth, even tried to claim the throne after Charles died, arguing that his parents had secretly married. They hadn't. Monmouth lost his head. But you can't say he didn't try. Let's float to France for a minute. Across the Channel, the French aristocracy had its own complicated relationship with illegitimacy. The French word bâtard became almost a social category of its own. A noble bastard wasn't a commoner, not really, but also not noble enough to inherit the family lands. So they lived in this strange middle world of semi-respectability. The bastard of Orléans, for example, was the half-brother of Charles, Duke of Orléans, and a famous knight in his own right. He fought alongside Joan of Arc, which probably helped with the PR. By all accounts, he was loyal, brave, and popular. Though I imagine he still had to deal with nobles calling him bastard in meetings and pretending it was just a nickname. France even had entire laws defining how bastards could use their family name. Some could use it if they were recognized by the father. Others had to modify it, adding little suffixes or place names to make it clear they were, the discount edition. The ironic afterlife of illegitimacy. The funny part is that as time went on, bastards became oddly fashionable, at least in literature. Poets, chroniclers, and playwrights loved writing about the tragic, misunderstood child of sin. They became symbols of passion, rebellion, and melancholy, everything the church hated, which probably explains their popularity. Even Shakespeare couldn't resist. He gave us Edmund in King Lear, the bitter, illegitimate son who decides to overthrow everyone just because society keeps calling him base, which, to be fair, is a very understandable reaction. The emotional toll. If we slow down for a moment, and it's okay to yawn here, we're in sleepy history mode, we can imagine what this all felt like. Being born illegitimate in medieval Europe wasn't just a legal status. It was a constant reminder that you didn't quite belong anywhere. You could be loved privately but shunned publicly, praised for your talent but denied your name. Some of these children grew up in noble households, raised alongside their legitimate half-siblings, but always slightly apart. At a smaller table with fewer servants, wearing hand-me-downs from brothers who would one day inherit entire counties. It must have been strange, knowing your blood was royal, but your life was not. And maybe that's why so many of them became warriors, priests, or adventurers. When the world tells you you're nothing, you either disappear quietly or decide to make your own title. Floating. Toward the High Middle Ages, as we drift into the 14th and 15th centuries, the concept of legitimacy started to get even more political. Kings realized that who counted as legitimate could be used as a weapon. If you wanted to disinherit someone, you just declared their parents' marriage invalid. Instant bastard. Problem solved. It was weaponized genealogy. the medieval version of cancel culture, but with papal documents instead of Twitter threads. For example, the 100 Years' War between England and France. Yes, that century-long shouting match over who got to wear the fancier crown was partly triggered by questions of legitimacy. Edward III of England claimed the French throne through his mother, Isabella. But the French argued that royal succession couldn't pass through the female line. The irony? The French crown had previously recognized bastards as princes when it suited them. But when it didn't, suddenly, bloodlines mattered again. Because medieval politics was less about consistency and more about convenience. Paperwork, power, and the papal oops button. Welcome back, wanderer of late-night history. If you've made it this far, you're either genuinely fascinated by medieval social structures, or you've been trying to fall asleep for 20 minutes and can't find your charger. Either way, let's keep going. Last time, we wandered through the early centuries, when being born illegitimate was like carrying a big flashing sign that said, "Not allowed to inherit anything." Now, let's float gently into the later medieval period, where things got even messier, more bureaucratic, and occasionally hilarious. Because when you mix human desire with medieval paperwork and papal pride, you get centuries of genealogical confusion that historians are still trying to untangle. The art of retroactive morality. By the 14th century, Europe had perfected the fine art of pretending that embarrassing things had never happened. And the church, as usual, led the way. If a powerful nobleman had an affair and accidentally produced a small, noisy political problem, there were options. You couldn't exactly delete the child, that was frowned upon, but you could fix the spiritual record. All you had to do was ask the Pope to issue a bull of legitimation. This was the medieval equivalent of clicking undo sin. You'd send a polite letter to Rome, filled with heartfelt remorse and a generous donation, usually enough gold to pay for a new wing of St. Peter's Basilica. And the Pope would graciously declare your child legitimate in the eyes of God. Of course, this didn't automatically make them legitimate under secular law. Kings and local lords could still refuse to recognize the child's rights. But socially, it helped a lot. And because popes were human too, and chronically underfunded, these legitimations became a booming side business. So much so that by the late 1300s, some clerics joked that the only thing rarer than a virgin in Rome was an illegitimate child who stayed that way. Nobles behaving badly. Let's glide over to England again, because honestly, that island was a goldmine of genealogical absurdity. By the late Middle Ages, noble families were intermarrying so aggressively that even minor scandals could unravel entire dynasties. So, when a child was born out of wedlock, nobles got creative. They invented phrases like "born before the espousals," meaning the couple was about to get married, just not quite there yet. It was the medieval equivalent of "we were on a break." And sometimes that actually worked. If the church believed the parents had intended to marry, the child might be granted what was called legitimatio per subsequens matrimonium, or, in plain English, "You're fine now," because mom and dad eventually made it official. But again, this only worked if the parents lived long enough to marry. If one of them inconveniently died before that happened, the child was back to being a nobody. So, yes, your entire social existence could hinge on whether your father managed to survive one more jousting tournament, the long shadow of the Beauforts. Let's revisit our old friends, the Beauforts, because their story is basically the medieval definition of "it's complicated." John of Gaunt, as we mentioned before, had a long, very public relationship with Catherine Swynford. Their children were born while he was still married to someone else, which, according to the church, made them illegitimate forever. But John eventually married Catherine after his wife died, and the Pope legitimated their children. End of story? Of course not. Decades later, when Henry VII, their descendant, took the throne, people dug through those papal documents like nosy relatives at a family reunion. They found a clause added later by Henry IV, another descendant, stating that while the Beauforts were legitimate, they could never inherit the crown. That little footnote technically meant the Tudors had no right to rule. But by the time anyone brought it up, Henry VII already had the crown, an army, and the general attitude of "try me." So, as usual, legitimacy was less about divine will and more about who had better lawyers and sharper swords: the royal bastards who refused to stay in the shadows. Now, despite all the stigma, some illegitimate royal children became stars of their time. Let's drift south to Portugal, where Afonso, Count of Barcelos, better known as Afonso the Bastard, managed to start an entire dynasty. He was the illegitimate son of King John I, but thanks to his father's affection and some very strategic marriages, he became one of the richest men in Portugal. His descendants eventually produced kings, explorers, and governors. Basically, Afonso turned the family label into a brand. Then there's Don Juan of Austria, the illegitimate son of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, born to a servant, raised in secret, and eventually revealed to be imperial blood, because that's how Habsburgs liked to keep things dramatic. Don Juan went on to command the Christian fleet at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, defeating the Ottomans in one of the biggest naval battles of the century. Which means, yes, one of Europe's most famous military heroes was technically a bastard. Apparently, the only thing illegitimacy couldn't stop was ambition. Bastards as political tools. By the later Middle Ages, some rulers even started using their illegitimate children as political tools. It sounds cynical, but this was peak medieval logic. Legitimate heirs were precious, too valuable to risk. Bastards, on the other hand, were disposable assets. They could be sent to govern tricky provinces, lead dangerous military campaigns, or marry politically volatile nobles without endangering the royal line. If they succeeded, great. The crown looked magnanimous. If they failed, well, that's what happens when you trust a bastard, isn't it? Charles II of England, who, as we mentioned, had an entire small army of illegitimate offspring, used this to perfection. He married one daughter to the Duke of Richmond, another to the Duke of Grafton, another to the Duke of St. Albans. By the end of his reign, half the English peerage was technically related to him by some kind of royal accident. It's impressive, really. A kind of long-term genetic networking strategy. The women who paid the price. Of course, behind every royal bastard was a woman whose life got complicated. Mistresses in medieval courts walked a dangerous tightrope. If they were discreet, charming, and lucky, they could live comfortably for years, maybe even get a house, a pension, or an official title like Lady of the Bedchamber. But if the relationship soured, or the king's wife got jealous, things went downhill fast. One wrong rumor could end in exile, forced marriage, or, in some tragic cases, accusations of witchcraft or poisoning. And if a child came from that relationship, the mother's fate often depended entirely on whether the father chose to acknowledge it. A royal acknowledgement could change everything. It was like flipping a social switch from shame to asset. But if he stayed silent, or worse, denied it, the mother could be ruined socially, and the child would grow up in the shadows. The contrast is almost absurd. For some women, bearing a king's child meant wealth and power. For others, it meant lifelong disgrace. The bastards who founded dynasties. The irony, of course, is that some of these illegitimate children ended up founding dynasties of their own. The House of Valois-Angoulême in France, which gave us King Francis I, started with a bastard branch of the royal Valois family. The Bourbons also descended partly from illegitimate lines. And in Scotland, the Stuart kings were particularly good at turning illegitimate children into valuable political chess pieces. James V, for instance, had so many acknowledged illegitimate children that he basically populated half the Scottish court. One of them, James Stuart, became Earl of Moray and ruled Scotland as regent after Queen Mary's downfall. So yes, in a poetic twist, a man born outside wedlock ended up governing the entire country. History, as usual, loves irony, everyday bastardy. Now, not all illegitimate children lived glamorous or tragic lives. Most simply lived ordinary ones. Though ordinary in medieval Europe is doing some heavy lifting. In towns and villages, the birth of a child outside wedlock was treated as a moral failing, sure, but it didn't usually end anyone's life. The local priest might scold the mother publicly, sometimes in front of the congregation, or impose a fine called a child white. But once the gossip died down, everyone went back to farming or dying of plague, whichever came first. In some communities, illegitimate children were even seen as lucky. Because they were born in passion, people said, they carried stronger life force or better luck in love. Others believed they were cursed, of course, because medieval Europe was nothing if not flexible with its superstitions. When legitimacy got political. By the 15th century, legitimacy had become weaponized. Kings and nobles learned that declaring someone illegitimate was a convenient way to erase them from the line of succession, or from the earth, depending on how tidy you wanted to be. One of the most famous examples is Richard III of England, who, depending on which historian you ask, may or may not have declared his nephews, the princes in the Tower, illegitimate to justify taking the throne himself. The official claim was that their father, Edward IV, had been pre-contracted to another woman before marrying their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, which meant the marriage, and therefore the sons, were invalid. Whether that was true or just convenient propaganda, we'll never know. But it shows how legitimacy was never really about morality. It was about control. From bastards to natural children. As we drift toward the end of the Middle Ages, the language around illegitimacy started to soften. By the 16th century, people began using the term natural child, a gentler, more diplomatic label that implied, yes, technically illegitimate, but let's not be rude about it. Royal bastards even started to receive coats of arms, modified versions of their father's crests, often with a little band or symbol to mark their difference. It was a subtle visual way of saying, I'm part of the family, just not that part. In many cases, they were raised in noble households, educated alongside legitimate siblings, and even given command of estates or regiments. They could never inherit the main title, but they could live quite comfortably, sometimes even better than the legitimate heirs who had the misfortune of being royal but poor. So, over time, the social sting dulled. Illegitimacy became less a moral curse and more an administrative inconvenience. The quiet human thread. If you close your eyes for a moment, yes, you can. It's that kind of story. You can almost picture the quieter reality behind all these politics. A mother alone in a stone chamber, giving birth while servants whisper. A young boy watching his noble father ride past without acknowledging him. A daughter dressed in silk but never introduced as lady. It's easy to laugh at the absurdities of medieval lineage, and we should, because honestly, they're hilarious. But beneath all the pomp was something very human, a deep, universal desire to belong. That's the thread that runs through every royal bastard, every papal decree, every nervous noble trying to explain to the Pope why his girlfriend's baby deserves a title. Because whether you were a peasant's child marked as filius nullius, or a prince called the Bastard of Burgundy, you were still part of the same messy, human story. And that story, like all the best medieval ones, is equal parts tragedy, irony, and a faint smell of incense and candle wax. From shame to style, the Renaissance bastards. Hey there, night wanderer, still awake? Or maybe half asleep with one earbud in, wondering how we've spent 2 episodes talking about medieval paperwork and family drama. Don't worry, you're in good company. Because tonight, we're entering a new era of European scandal, the Renaissance. That magical time when art flourished, popes threw parties that could rival modern music festivals, and being a bastard started to mean something entirely different. It wasn't just a social mark anymore, it was sometimes a brand, one you could lean into, decorate with jewels, and ride straight to power. Let's ease into it. The Renaissance, when morality took a coffee break. So, the Renaissance, roughly the 15th and 16th centuries, was supposed to be the age of enlightenment, and it was, in a sense. People rediscovered Greek philosophy, started painting human anatomy with alarming accuracy, and invented the concept of individual genius. But they also rediscovered an old truth. Power doesn't really care where you were born. As long as you could wield it, charm it, or marry it, legitimacy was flexible. The church still condemned extramarital affairs, of course, officially. Unofficially, popes had mistresses, bishops had entire families, and half the cardinals in Rome were someone's illegitimate cousin. It was a golden age for hypocrisy, and everyone was too busy admiring frescoes to notice. Enter the papal children. Let's start at the top, with the Vatican, because nothing says moral clarity quite like a pope with kids. One of the most infamous examples is Pope Alexander VI, better known as Rodrigo Borgia. He was Spanish, ambitious, and had about as much self-restraint as a medieval peacock. He openly fathered several children with his longtime mistress, Vannozza de Catane, and raised them as nobles. His daughter, Lucrezia Borgia, became one of the most famous, or infamous, women of the Renaissance, while his son, Cesare Borgia, basically invented the modern idea of the ruthless political prince. These were papal bastards, children of the Pope himself. and they weren't exactly hiding in the shadows. They ruled cities, commanded armies, and threw banquets that would make modern influencers blush. It's safe to say that by this point, born out of wedlock had lost much of its sting, at least in elite circles. Because if the Pope's kids were running Italy, who exactly was going to judge? Legitimacy as a weapon. That said, even during this wild, art-filled century, legitimacy still mattered. When it was convenient, kings used it as a diplomatic tool. Popes sold it like a premium subscription, and nobles wielded it like a dagger in court politics. Take the case of Cesare Borgia again. He was the illegitimate son of a pope, but when Alexander VI decided his son needed more credibility, he just fixed it. With a wave of papal authority, Cesare was made legitimate. Then he was made a cardinal. Then, when that got boring, he resigned his position and became a military commander. Imagine being so powerful that your father can both damn and redeem your soul, depending on the week. Royal bastards, the Golden Age. Now, beyond the Vatican, the 15th and 16th centuries were full of royal bastards who didn't just survive. They thrived. Let's glide gently to France, where King Francis I, the art-loving monarch who invited Leonardo da Vinci to hang out, had several illegitimate children he adored. He gave them titles, arranged good marriages, and even had portraits painted of them. In his court, being a royal bastard was practically a badge of culture. Meanwhile, in England, Henry VIII, yes, the one with the marital track record of a reality TV contestant, acknowledged at least one illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy. Fitzroy was showered with titles: Duke of Richmond, Duke of Somerset, and Lord High Admiral. He was even rumoured to be Henry's backup plan for the throne, if no legitimate male heir survived. Sadly, Fitzroy died young, possibly of tuberculosis, possibly of Tudor genetics. But the fact that Henry VIII considered him for succession shows how far attitudes had shifted. A century earlier, no one would have entertained that idea. By the 1530s, the king was basically shopping for loopholes. Spain and the natural sons. In Spain, where noble bloodlines were practically a national sport, illegitimate children were often called hijos naturales, natural sons. It sounds oddly gentle, doesn't it? As if they'd been grown in a medieval greenhouse. Spanish nobles, especially in the powerful houses of Castile and Aragon, treated their illegitimate children with surprising warmth. They were often raised in the same households as legitimate heirs, educated by tutors, and prepared for military or clerical careers. Of course, they couldn't inherit the major titles, but they could still become generals, bishops, or viceroys, which, in Renaissance Spain, was nothing to sneeze at. Sometimes they even acted as mediators between legitimate siblings, because being slightly outside the inheritance race made them neutral, or at least less likely to stab someone over land. So yes, in a way, being a bastard could actually make you more useful. The House of Medici, family goals and failures. Let's float over to Italy again, because honestly, that's where most of the fun happened. The Medici family of Florence, those legendary bankers, art patrons, and occasional popes, were no strangers to illegitimate children. Giulio de' Medici, for example, was the illegitimate son of Giuliano de' Medici, the one who got murdered in the Pazzi conspiracy. Despite being born outside wedlock, Giulio was recognized by the family, educated, and eventually became Pope Clement VII. Yes, another papal bastard. Because at this point, why not? He later crowned Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor, commissioned artists like Michelangelo, and helped cause the small inconvenience known as the Sack of Rome in 1527. So, depending on your perspective, he was either a triumphant survivor or the ultimate example of what happens when you give too much power to people with complicated family trees. Noble illegitimacy, the prestige factor. By the late Renaissance, illegitimacy wasn't necessarily a source of shame, at least not in high society. In some cases, it even carried a kind of romantic prestige. After all, what could be more Renaissance than being the forbidden fruit of a great love affair? Writers and poets leaned into this idea hard. Illegitimate sons became tragic heroes, passionate, ambitious, slightly dangerous. Illegitimate daughters were cast as mysterious beauties, symbols of fate and forbidden desire. It's as if society collectively decided to turn its moral failings into art, and then sell tickets. The gender divide persists. Still, let's not get too dreamy about it. For all the glamour and poetry, illegitimate girls still had it worse. A royal or noble bastard son might become a general or bishop. A daughter might, if she was lucky, get a strategic marriage, but more often, she was quietly packed off to a convent. Not out of cruelty exactly, just practicality. The fewer claims she could make on the family fortune, the better. That said, some women turned even that to their advantage. Lucrezia Borgia, for instance, used her reputation, however exaggerated, to become one of the most politically powerful women in Italy. She married 3 times, ran Ferrara like a pro, and sponsored poets, painters, and scientists. Her illegitimate origins were never forgotten, but they didn't stop her either. So, yes, the Renaissance might not have fixed gender inequality, but it did produce a few women who learned how to weaponize a scandal. The bastards who ruled anyway. Let's take a slow breath and drift toward France again, where the lines between legitimate and not were so blurry that even historians need family trees with color coding. One of the most interesting figures here is Antoine, Duke of Vendôme, who married Jeanne d'Albret and fathered Henri of Navarre. Later, Henry IV of France. Now, Henry IV was legitimate, but he was surrounded by half-brothers, cousins, and courtiers of various shades of legitimacy. And he didn't seem to mind. He famously said, "Paris is worth a mass," when converting to Catholicism for political reasons, which tells you all you need to know about Renaissance morality. Henry's court was filled with acknowledged illegitimate children, including his own. He treated them with generosity, marrying them off well and providing for them lavishly. Because in Renaissance France, legitimacy wasn't so much a question of moral purity as one of financial management. If you could afford to make your bastards respectable, society would politely pretend not to notice. The Northern twist. Meanwhile, in Northern Europe, in places like the German states and Scandinavia, the story was slightly more conservative. Protestant reformers, bless them, had opinions. When Martin Luther and his friends started reshaping Christianity, they emphasized moral discipline, which meant less tolerance for open royal mistresses and papal-style scandals. That didn't stop kings from having illegitimate children, of course. It just meant they got better at pretending they didn't. Swedish and Danish kings in the 1500s had natural sons tucked away in country estates, often given military commands or bishoprics far from court, out of sight out of sin. And because the Reformation loved efficiency, even their legitimation processes became bureaucratic. Official decrees, signed papers, and clean ledgers. Nothing says Protestant moral order like sin filed in triplicate. Art, scandal, and the bastard aesthetic. By the end of the 16th century, illegitimacy had taken on a new kind of artistic glow. Painters depicted royal bastards in fine clothing, often with subtle symbols, a diagonal stripe across the coat of arms, or a slightly off-center crown to hint at their status. Writers romanticized them. Philosophers mused about whether virtue could be inherited. Playwrights, especially in Elizabethan England, turned bastards into complex characters. We've already mentioned Shakespeare's Edmund from King Lear, but there's also Philip the Bastard from King John, a loyal, witty, cynical soldier who becomes one of the play's moral anchors. It's fascinating how art gave these figures a kind of redemption long before society did. Because on stage and canvas, at least, bastards could be brilliant. They could be heroes. They could even be human. The quiet end of the stigma. By the early 1600s, Europe was changing again. Wars of religion, expanding empires, and new social mobility meant old hierarchies started to crumble. Illegitimacy never disappeared. It just became less defining. It still mattered for inheritance and marriage alliances, sure, but in everyday life, not so much. Commoners stopped caring entirely. Aristocrats learned to manage it quietly, and the church, ever pragmatic, found new sins to worry about. It's almost poetic, really. After centuries of sermons, laws, and scandals, the great medieval obsession with legitimacy faded into background noise, replaced by nationalism, class, and money, because nothing ages faster than moral panic. A soft landing. So, as we drift to the end of this long, meandering story, let's step back for a moment. From the lonely medieval peasant-marked child of no one, to the royal bastard commanding armies in silk and gold. The story of illegitimacy in Europe is really just the story of power. Who has it, who doesn't, and how people bend the rules to get it. Some were erased from history, others became kings, popes, and conquerors. But all of them, in their quiet, scandalous way, remind us that human nature hasn't changed much. We still make rules we can't follow. We still love what we shouldn't. And we still find ways to justify it afterwards. So tonight, as you drift off, remember, half the crowns of Europe were held by people who technically shouldn't have had them. And somehow, the world kept turning anyway. Sleep well with that thought.